Thank you for joining us. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for today's training on process efficiency. My name is Isabel Garcia, and I am based here in Chicago, Illinois. And I am a Government Innovation Fellow here at the Government Performance Lab, where I've been very involved in the creation and the implementation of the Procurement Excellence Network, otherwise known as PEN. So for those of you who don't know, PEN is a free online community for state and local procurement professionals who want to transform their procurement to be more efficient and fair, results-driven, strategic, and equitable. And we really see these as our key pillars of procurement excellence. And today we're going to focus on our efficiency pillar. I'm joined by several of my colleagues here at the GPL this afternoon, so I wanted to make sure that they also had a chance to introduce themselves. So Hope, I will hand it over to you to introduce yourself next.
Thanks, Isabel. Hi, everyone. My name is Hope Patterson, and I am a Government Innovation Fellow at the GPL. I work really closely with both Isabel and Elena on the Procurement Excellence Network, and it's been a part of my life for the past couple of years. So it's really exciting to see all of you here today to talk about process efficiency, and we're really glad to have you. I will pass it over to Elena next.
Hi, everyone. Really excited to talk about process mapping today. I know that slow procurement processes are a pain point for so many cities and counties across the country. So we're really excited to be diving into that topic today. I'm Elena Hofnagel. I'm an assistant director at the GPL, and I lead a big chunk of our work to provide light touch support and technical assistance to governments who are transforming how they do procurement. So great to have you all with us today. Let me pass to Dominique.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dominique Saunier, and I'm a Government Innovation Fellow, the newest on the PEN team, and I'm very excited to work with you all and looking forward to scaling best practices and sharing with the world how cool procurement can be. I'll pass it over to Charlie.
Hi, everyone. Great to see everyone today for the call. My name is Charlie Kargman. I'm a project leader here at the GPL. I currently support our state's procurement work, overseeing an engagement with Pennsylvania's Department of Labor and Industry focused on workforce development contracts. I'm really excited to dive deep into process and how we can make it as efficient and results-driven as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. And thanks to everyone introducing themselves in the chat. Margaret, I just learned that if you meet someone from Tuscaloosa, you have to say roll tide back. So roll tide back to you. Great. So we are a big team and we are excited to get started today. Today's 90-minute session is going to be broken up into 3 different parts. We're going to start with an overview of procurement processes and what tends to slow down procurement processes. We're then going to move into a deep dive of process maps and then how to actually use these process maps from documentation to actually making change and solving procurement efficiency challenges. So during this presentation, we're going to highlight a few different government examples that we've seen here at the GPL that have used process maps to make improvements. And as a heads up, you will see all of our GPL faces again throughout this presentation because we're going to break out into breakout rooms twice for a facilitated activity and discussion. So we will be sure to share all of these materials with you after the event. But just so you know, we've already posted them onto our event page on the website, so you can access them and follow along at home. And Hope will put share the link to those in the chat. So part 1, the overview of procurement processes. So as Elena was saying in her introduction, procurement processes are really some of the most common issues that have been raised by the state and local governments that we work with. So we're going to start by discussing some common problems that we've seen. We know that procurement processes can be oftentimes inefficient, and this has led to, in a lot of governments, substantial additional cost times. It can really create headache for vendors, and it can lead to costly delays, which can really result in worse outcomes for residents. So here we've tried to highlight some of the main causes that slow down these procurement processes. The first is when we see redundant, unnecessary, and oftentimes dated compliance measures. So sometimes we frequently see, something we frequently see are multiple rounds of approval processes. So things like requiring signatures and notarization. Next, We see a number of communication problems where staff and departments really don't know what's involved in the procurement process and how to even get it started. So this might be due to a lack of training. It could be due to a lack of standardized guidance, or in some of the governments we work in, the system is so decentralized that there's really no sharing of information or knowledge across departments. And not working together and this extensive back and forth can really lead to an RFP that isn't well written. So one where there isn't a goal clearly defined, which means that procurement staff have to end up answering a lot of questions or responding to questions from vendors on the back end. And this adds a lot of time into the procurement process. And then the last thing that we want to note is that we know that there is grave understaffing in procurement departments, which often leads to staff in the position of being reactive, so such as things like processing requisitions, instead of thinking proactively. And a main point that we want to underscore, we put it in red and in bold at the bottom, is that we really want to address these procurement process problems because a confusing and a burdensome procurement process can crowd out important strategic thinking around what goals and outcomes a new contracted service or program should achieve. Hopefully some of these causes resonate with folks. We're going to get into a couple of more examples when we go into our government examples, but I would love to take a minute to hear from all of you what other key contributors have led to slower processes in your own government. So feel free to put them in the chat, or you can come off mute and share them out loud with the group. So we'll take a minute to hear from all of you. Seeing some in the chat. So feel free to keep sharing different key contributors that have led to a slower process in your government, so we can really use those real examples as anchors as we move through today's training. Great. So before we really dive in, I think that it goes without saying that if a confusing and a burdensome process can crowd out strategic thinking, then we can imagine how a good process, and by good, I mean one that is both efficient and fair, is actually the necessary foundation for a government to leverage procurement to achieve its strategic goals and its intended outcomes for its residents. So we have a couple of bullets here on what a good procurement process means, or how we're thinking of that. It means less time spent on administrative activities and more time spent on strategy and planning. It is a process that is easy to navigate and accessible for everyone involved. So for government staff, for new and incumbent vendors, and for various community stakeholders. It means one where roles are clearly delegated and that we have the right inputs from the right people at the right time. And then also one that is consistent and a predictable experience for everyone involved. So ultimately, again, put it in bold because it's important. We really believe that efficiency is the foundation for procurement transformation. But we know that efficiency can be really difficult to achieve, which is why we are all here today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Charlie, who is going to take us into process mapping, which we think is really one of the most effective practices that we have to streamline procurement. So Charlie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. So let's just talk about what is process mapping and why is it useful. Next slide. So at a basic level, a process map is a visual diagram that represents every step in a process from start to end. So you begin with some sort of input and the process concludes with an output. Given this is about procurement, that output's usually a final RFP or a signed contract. But what's great about this diagram, it's not merely a picture, but there are diagrams and shapes for every step in the process that identify who is doing that step, what are they doing, and what are the resources required. And by putting all this together where you could just see it mapped out, literally, it's easier to diagnose problems and figure out what can we do to build a smoother process that's easier on everyone and gets us results. Next slide. So a process map, first and foremost, is a diagnostic tool. And as you assemble this process map, working with your procurement teams, but other programmatic teams, legal, finance administration in your jurisdiction, you're going to accomplish a number of different things. First and foremost, let's start with the basics. You're gathering information. You're understanding what is involved in the process that you think everybody knows, but in fact, when you do these process mapping exercises, you realize there are actually a lot of nitty-gritty parts that you may have overlooked. So you gather information, and a similar point that as you gather that information, you're actually building consensus. That ideally, at the end of the process mapping session, you come to a conclusion that here we go. We have all agreed that this is the set of steps that's involved in this procurement process. And just that act is really radical to create a foundation for efficiency and process improvement efforts. And once you have that consensus, then you tons of possibilities. Find opportunities to reduce waste, find gaps or overlaps or repetitive processes. Maybe you realize, in fact, this is a process we should edit a bit or actually design a new process to improve outcomes. And in doing all this, you find a new strategic alignment that maybe this is your opportunity as a leader, as a director to say, our process used to be oriented towards compliance or oriented towards requirements. I saw that in the chat. We're now going to build it towards results or impact. Let's do this together. So next slide. So why I love process mapping, having done it, having seen it, is that on one level, yes, you're doing this information gathering, you're diagnosing problems, but you're actually doing a lot of work and groundwork to make change in your city, your state, or your county. That as you're working with other teams to write a process map, you're getting their buy-in. You're getting them on board with what you want to see from a future process and maybe get their ideas for how we can get there or what adjustments we can make. It also elevates the strategic importance of procurement. It's you as a procurement leader saying, I really want this procurement function to work really well for our city or our county or our state. And it's really key that we get this right such that we bring results to residents. It's also a way to have a space to identify areas of confusion or things that weren't really clear before. Oh, wow, I didn't realize that the legal review process was this much of a black box. Let's unpack that a little bit. Or, wow, we haven't really considered the vendor experience here. How can we learn more about that? So a process map is a good pause to get that feedback and have that discussion. And what's nice is that the literal map is something that you can publish to use with customer departments, residents, vendors to just explain the procurement process, demystify it, and show what role they play in getting great products or great services. Now, I'll pause here to say the process map is not the utopia. The process map is the current state of affairs and really getting that understanding such that you can build from there to make change. So next slide. So what form does a process map commonly take? Most of the time, it's going to look like a flow chart. What you read from left to right, that's a series of shapes that indicate different steps in the process. At the beginning is typically some sort of circle, sometimes it's an oval, and that's where the process map begins. And the process map continues until you reach another oval or a circle that shares the output. Let's say it's a final RFP. The tasks and the steps you find in these boxes or rectangles. And if you find a really good process map, the box will say very clearly, this actor did this action. So not just the purchasing team, not just legal, a buyer does this, the administrative assistant does this, very clearly, crisply. And then eventually you get to a diamond. And the diamond is not an action, it's actually a question, it's a fork in the road. Does the solicitation add up to more than $40,000, which is our formal competitive procurement threshold? Does this involve construction? And if yes, you go one path. If no, you go another path. It's almost like playing one of those dungeon video games where you have opportunities to go to different doors. The diamond is the different doors. Where can you go with this process? And this is the general rule of the road, and the arrows will indicate where's the next step. But the key thing to emphasize, I said this before, but I'll say it again. You want a 30,000-foot view here. This is just general trends. You're going to have staff that say, oh, we had this emergency procurement purchase where we did this, or in fact, this was a really important. That is not the purpose of the process map. The purpose of the process map is to have an understanding of what's going to happen 80% of the time in this process, and then build from there. Next slide. So don't tell Southwest, but we're using an airport baggage handling example to see this process map in play. So here we're taking putting your baggage for a flight, and you'll see all the principles I described acted out here. So you have that circle, that's the input, putting the baggage on the conveyor belt. Then you have these different boxes indicating what someone is going to be doing. So staff A weighs baggage, staff A tags baggage. Now notice I didn't make a big square to say staff A weighs and tags baggage, even though there were two actions being done by staff A. Albert will say, these are two separate actions that Albert is doing. We should separate those so we know the sequence that we want to weigh the baggage before we tag it. So it's really important to make sure it's one action per box. We then get to this diamond. We have a question. Is it standard baggage, yes or no? So here we've identified a yes. If it is standard baggage, staff B is just going to put it to the second conveyor belt. But if no, we're going to go to the oversized baggage desk. And we continue along until we get to a circle that says this is the end of the process. We've concluded our process map. Now, there are a number of ways to actually build one of these out. Visio, Miro, Lucidchart all work, but any of this software will be familiar with the different shapes, their purpose, and make it easy to draw arrows and fill in the boxes. Next slide. So you're probably wondering, oh, do I have to use a flowchart? Absolutely not. Flowchart's not the only way to do this. In fact, I've actually run some process mapping sessions virtually where I've used a spreadsheet. So a spreadsheet actually just makes a row for every step instead of shapes. So as you can see here, each row has a column for a step description, an owner, the number, but the same principles apply. You want to write just a concise action in the description, one owner, a buyer, or just a specific person. The only difference is that because we're doing the same shape, it's the same row, to identify a question, we're going to highlight it in a different color. So in this case, we use pink to indicate this is a branching point. And then you can use maybe an alphabetical notation like 16A or 16B to identify different steps. Now, this is a little clunky, but it's still the advantage of a spreadsheet is that you can create a shareable doc. People could just add in steps. And in fact, what I would recommend with a spreadsheet like this is to use it just to collect the steps and get confirmation on the order, and then use that spreadsheet to build out an actual flow chart. But on the next slide, we have an example. So Citylandia, we'll be going back here very shortly. This is where we use the spreadsheet for bid evaluation. And again, all the principles at play here. We have step numbers, we have clear actors, administrative assistant, buyer. The pink, that's step 7, was the solicitation IFB or an RFP? And 8A, as you can see here, this is the RFP step. So just know that like flowcharts are great. There's a lot of advantages to them, but they can sometimes be harder to collaborate with on, or maybe inaccessible to some folks. So you feel free to use the spreadsheet. And actually, Heather, just to answer your question live, sometimes you're doing multiple sessions. I think don't put pressure on yourself that you're going to get all the steps in one session. You may, certainly my time in Tulsa, which we'll speak to in a second, we did multiple sessions to really figure out the full process. All right, but next slide. So you've heard me talk about this, but in fact, the best way to learn is to do. So in fact, we are taking a trip to Citylandia, where we're going to look at the RFP process there. We have a great process map available, and you'll find on this process map, it doesn't just have the shapes, but we actually have some quotations from some discussions we've had with staff to really unpack what's going on. So what we're going to do in breakout groups, some of you will be with me or my colleagues, is read through this map and think about what seems off, what could be a potential pain point, where should we dig deeper, and see ways that we can actually make the process more efficient and streamlined. So in a moment, you'll be put into a breakout group and we'll talk about this for about 10 minutes. And then I will just moderate a brief discussion reporting back on our findings and insights.
Okay, you all will be prompted to go to your breakout rooms very soon.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed your trip to Citylandia as we looked into their procurement process with maybe a couple of pain points and flaws. So as we get started, just put in the chat or voiceover, what were some pain points that you observed or things you want to dive deeper into? Feel free to add on the chat or raise your hand and voice over. I'll add that in our group, our group 5, we talked about 2 things that raised concerns. One was it was unclear who was responding to vendor questions, and that could be a real pain point. And that the director was reviewing the solicitation twice. And like, it was that the most efficient use of time. And Margaret, great point. We talked about that too, that there were a lot of general statements, but there wasn't a particular person identified. Approvals are very much a hang up. We've definitely seen that. And that's a great point too, Heather, that staff alone cannot write RFPs, that this is a collaboration with a programmatic department and procurement. Oh, Erica, nice. What a good roundup from our group. We also discussed too, training opportunities, that it seemed like procurement was getting involved in the process quite late. And can we use a training to create an earlier touch point, a point of collaboration, such that things like evaluation committees and vendor outreach or common questions are discussed early on. We'll take one more comment or voiceover before I pass the mic. Oh, that's a great point, Hope, that the evaluation's coming quite late. All right, well, I will now pass it along to Elena to talk about how we can use the process map to diagnose problems. Elena.
Great. Thanks so much, Charlie. We had just such a wonderful discussion in my group, and I'm assuming so many others did as well. So we're now going to dive in a bit more deeply to give you some practical tips for doing your own process mapping session and creating your own process map that will help you diagnose what are some of the biggest bottlenecks and pain points in your process. So let's go on to the next slide. So what we've really seen is that there are 3 really important things to be thinking about when you're creating a process map. First up is people. So deciding who is going to be involved in the mapping, how are you going to prepare those folks? Who are the right stakeholders to engage? Preparation, how are you going to prepare for that process mapping session? And then finally, method. So what does it actually look like to hold that process mapping session with your colleagues? So if we go into the next slide, let's talk about preparation first. So one tip I'll give from my experience doing this in many different governments is that you first want to decide what are your boundaries for the process mapping session. So I know that every government doesn't actually just have one procurement process, right? You probably have a separate process for bids, a separate process for RFPs, a separate process for, small dollar P card purchases. And so just focusing in on one process first can make the whole activity much less overwhelming. And then often it's useful to start with a process that people are really motivated to fix, right? So is there one thing that always seems to go wrong, one component of a much larger process that always seems to go wrong? And think about starting there. If we go into the next slide, including the right staff in your process mapping session is almost like this really delicate art. You don't want the session to be so big that you're just fighting over every aspect of the process, but you do really want to make sure that you have a good, diverse group of stakeholders. So thinking about including customer departments, folks from legal, folks from finance, even folks from like the city clerk's office or data or IT can really actually help you understand what their pieces of the process look like, rather than just looking at it from your perspective, maybe in purchasing, if that's where you sit. I think it's so tempting to feel like this can be an exclusive activity and you should only invite like department directors or the city clerk herself. But actually including a whole bunch of frontline staff and more junior staff who are the people who are actually doing the process step is super important because they're going to have a better understanding of how the process actually happens on the ground than some of your managers will. And then finally, let's go on to the next slide. Actually creating the process map with your colleagues. Let's talk about the methodology for that. So as Charlie was mentioning, holding in-person process mapping sessions can be a really fun activity. You kind of have to sell it though. You know, in some of our projects that we've done, you know, we've played music while people are process mapping, brought snacks, you know, really tried to sell this as a great opportunity to collaborate on something in person with your colleagues. If you're in more of a remote environment though, doing it virtually can be just as impactful. What I'd really encourage you to do for this first session is kind of take out of your brain what that ideal process looks like and try to just focus on mapping your current state and what actually happens now. And so even before figuring out which step is a pain point, which step is a bottleneck, just try to get all the steps down and who is generally most of the time responsible for each step. One big question that we often get is, you know, what is the right level of detail to include in a process map? So should you be including every single email, every single, you know, folder that is filed? And that's definitely not the goal. You know, as Charlie was mentioning earlier, just trying to get kind of a good view of 80% of the process is what you should be aiming for in this first activity. There's definitely going to be stakeholders in the process that aren't in this first mapping session. And so figuring out how you can go to them afterwards with this process map to refine it is often a really good next step following this process. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it back over to Isabel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elena. And Elena and Charlie for really laying out how we build a process map. And now we're going to move into, you know, how do we move from documentation to change? So once we actually have our process map created, it's really exciting because this is going to be one of the most useful tools in your procurement reform toolkit. But what do we do with it now? So here are 4 steps that we're going to walk through in depth to provide you a framework of how you can actually use your process map to bring change over time. The first step will be to analyze your process map and identify areas to focus your efforts. So once you have your completed process map, we begin by reviewing actually each step of the process with an eye towards understanding whether each step is a value add, a non-value add, or business necessary. So value add steps are those that are actually improving the quality and the accuracy of the final product, whereas non-value add steps are unnecessary steps that might no longer be needed. And when I say business necessary, those are the steps that we'd all prefer not to do, but they're required by policy, legislation, and they're for purposes like safety. So those we are not cutting out. To figure out what kind of step you're looking at, we've given you a couple of questions to consider here. So you can ask yourself, what's excessive? Are there rounds of review or due diligence efforts that seem to take more time than they're worth? So I'm thinking about, you know, in the activity going back to the director twice. You might ask, what seems missing in this process? So are there steps that we can loop in or complete simultaneously to make our process more proactive, strategic, and value add? I know in my group, Adetun from Phoenix was talking about there are no subject matter experts here. Who is actually coming into the RFP writing? How are they actually going to write a good RFP? We might ask, are things being done consistently? So are there major discrepancies in whether steps are always followed, and do some people skip certain steps? And then the last one we keep coming back to, but does this process include the right people? So are there other staff that we could actually be incorporating into the process, or should anyone be brought in earlier in the process? So as we're analyzing these different steps and using these questions to help us figure out whether a step is a value add or non-value add, you should begin to consider what changes you can make to actually improve the step if necessary. So for example, those lengthy steps that are repetitive or unnecessary to the final product, maybe consider cutting them. You know, there's really no use in keeping something that's not helping your final product. And this alone can really reduce cycle times and increase efficiency. On the flip side, if there is a step that's really improving the quality and the accuracy of your final product, strengthen it. So really helping people to continue to pursue these actions. So this might mean something like writing documents or trainings to help cement best practices. For those where you find gaps in services and you realize that important needs are not being met, this is a really great place to propose and build new steps in your process in collaboration with your colleagues. So I'll add here that you should really not be afraid to add steps if it's going to help you in the long run. So you can think of this as an investment in more time upfront for less time in the future. So less time reviewing or correcting the RFP in the long run. And then lastly, if there's this poor delegation and staff are not sure who is responsible for what, this is a really great moment to reset and adjust who is assigned to which part of the process and communicate these changes with your stakeholders accordingly. So in just a bit, we're going to go back to our process maps and we're actually going to analyze them together. But any questions before I move on analyzing your process map? Okay, great. So step 2 is assess obstacles to change. So you've analyzed your process map and you're feeling really good because you've identified different parts where there are a number of steps that are non-value add. But before you actually jump to cutting these steps or revising how the sub-process takes place, it's really important to take a moment to remember and to acknowledge that the idea of change is disruptive. So this doesn't mean that we don't make change, but it means assessing and mitigating immunity to change. So what I mean by that is that people really attach their identity to their work roles and functions. So even these mundane changes can be a big shift in how people operate and can change their experience at work. So for example, you might think that removing an administrative task 100% of the time is a welcome process change. But that administrative task might actually be something that brings someone joy during their day, or it provides them, you know, the chance to relax during an otherwise extremely stressful day. So we can picture the admin who listens to her favorite podcast as she's scanning bid documents received. Taking away this task is really taking away part of her job that she loves. Another example is that, you know, many of us have a unique set of fears around the unknown. So staff might be filled with worries on topics that haven't been discussed much. They might wonder, you know, will I know how to use this new program? Will my file structure be preserved? And, you know, the $1 million question, is my job becoming obsolete? So it might feel like someone is losing something really important to them, even if from the outside it looks like, well, I'm just eliminating a redundant step. So on the bottom, we've put 3 different strategies for how you can think about overcoming this immunity to change. The first one would be to understand competing commitments. So government staff have many different responsibilities, values, and conflicting goals. And while a staff member may want to change, or they outwardly say that they welcome change, there is this underlying competing commitment that is conflicting with this change. So an example of this, you know, there is a project manager who's dragging her feet on completing an assignment. And you think, that's weird. Why doesn't she want to complete this assignment? But when you actually look at the competing commitment, you see that she's worried that once she finishes this assignment, she's going to be assigned something even tougher that she fears that she can't actually deliver on. And so that's preventing her from completing the task at hand. So identifying these competing commitments can be really important to understand how to move the project forward. The next strategy we have here is to lead with empathy. So even when the rational argument for change is clear, stakeholders' fears and feelings need addressing. So in this case, reassuring an employee that their job is changing, but that it is not becoming obsolete, and that you're actually already thinking ahead of how you're going to fill in that extra time that they're going to have to now work on other strategic tasks. And then the last thing we have here as a strategy is to really develop sustainable solutions that are adaptable to an evolving environment over just, quick technical fixes. Questions on step 2? Great. And then step 3, so piloting changes. So here we really recommend starting small and working with your leadership to gain buy-in for piloting a small change to the process. So it's a great way to demonstrate the impact of process improvements and to build momentum for implementation. So you'll see on this slide that we start suggesting with 2 to 3 smaller changes. It can be really helpful to pilot these changes with one specific procurement or one specific department or agency. And I will say that the success of any pilot really depends on communication, openness, and engagement with the frontline staff who run these processes. So you'll see we have a little dialogue on the right-hand side here demonstrating this, where the procurement staff says, we're really excited to pilot the streamlined RFP approval process with the Department of Sanitation. Here's our rollout plan and instructions for staff. And the department staff might respond, I'm interested, but I'm nervous about this process. What if it makes my job harder? To which the procurement staff responds, that's exactly why we're piloting it. We're going to learn from this pilot, get your feedback, and make the changes if we need to. So it's really important to talk about the changes that you've made openly and widely and to seek feedback from this frontline staff. Asking questions like, is this new process working well? Are there modifications that can be made based on the experience of the staff or the vendors? This can help you overcome reluctance and resistance and can then help you pilot out to even broader changes. The last step here is we have share, communicate, and engage. So like I was just saying on the last slide, really don't overlook the importance of communication throughout your process improvement journey. So we recommend identifying a few key moments to share information within and outside your department. When you're piloting, a new change or you're seeking feedback on process improvements. And one of the best ways we've seen to really build consensus around the procurement process is to actually publish the final process map that you've created. And we'll show you a couple of really nice examples a little bit later. But your process map can be an invaluable resource, both to new and senior staff members, because it's going to provide them a clear description of the different steps in a procurement process and also offer them valuable metrics. You can also use your process map to train others. So you might consider including it in onboarding materials or different training procedures. And then the last thing I'll add is that your process map really gives you valuable data into metrics and metrics such as cycle times and roles. So we've put a couple of different examples of metrics here. So this first example of it giving you a view into cycle time. So how long is a process taking and what are the stages that are taking the longest to complete, as well as, really understanding how many procurements are you actually processing per quarter. And it helps you see who actually owns different parts of this procurement process. So this data on cycle time and role delegation and so on can be very helpful for performance management and evaluation. Great. So we are going to go back into our breakout rooms in just a minute. But before I move on, I just wanted to ask if there were any questions on these 4 steps that I just went over. Okay, great. So in a moment, Dominique is going to send us back into breakout rooms. Just looking at the clock, we will go back into these breakout rooms for 10 minutes where you're going to work with your group and your facilitator on how to analyze the process map and actually identify how we can make change over time using our process map. So Dominique, if you could go ahead and send us into breakout rooms and bring us back in 10 minutes. Thanks. Okay, great. Welcome back, everyone. We hope that you had, I'm just going to get my slide share back up. We hope that everyone had a really great discussion. Because we are running a little bit short on time, feel free to share any insights that you had into the chat. But I am going to move us along, and I'm going to hand it back over to Elena and Charlie to bring us through some government examples where we've seen government successfully use process mapping to cut cycle time and reduce waste. So Charlie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Isabel. So in Tulsa, in my project here, we actually did do a full process mapping series of sessions. So we first mapped the process, but then we actually stress tested it with focus groups and follow-up interviews with not just buyers, but also other key stakeholders such as legal, vendors, other customer departments. And that was helpful just to build that consensus, as I mentioned earlier, to understand what are the steps, resources, and time required at each stage of the process. And we had a lot of insights, but we took action. First and foremost, we looked at our forms. We saw that we required 5 different signatures and 3 notarizations, and that felt too much. So we met with legal and reduced it to 1 signature and 1 notarization requirement, took out about 6 pages from the total IFB and RFP document length, which is incredibly helpful for us. We also looked at the review. In fact, that twice directorial review reminded me of in Tulsa, we had this committee called the Standard Specifications and Awards Committee that had representation from different departments, and they reviewed every solicitation before it went out. But that didn't seem like a value add to us, as they weren't in procurement and they also did not write the scope of work. So we said, let's just remove that review entirely and have the purchasing director be the final review after it's gone through the programmatic team as well as the buyers. And last, and probably most notably, when we were looking at the process map, we actually used cycle times to identify that legal review was taking a long time. And there was this back and forth between purchasing staff and the vendor to often address a legal issue that we were only catching at the end after a contract had been awarded, because that's when legal was reviewing the materials. But we were like, wait a minute, if legal can review this in the beginning and the solicitation drafting process, we could address errors early internally. And then once it's with the vendor and it's between the vendor and the city of Tulsa, it's just a matter of just signing a couple of documents before we ink the agreement. So we moved the legal review process at the beginning. And these 3 things together contributed to a cycle time reduction by 3 weeks on average. So close to 20% decrease from before we made these changes. So it's all to say that a process map can be really helpful and find those small fixes that could add up to big change.
Thanks, Charlie. If we go into the next slide, I'm happy to share an example from Los Angeles. So when I was working in Los Angeles, we did a whole bunch of different process mapping sessions to try to identify the process that city departments went through to procure professional services. This is actually one of the small components of a very much larger map that stretched across the whole conference room wall. But what was really interesting is that we invited stakeholders from a whole bunch of city departments to participate in this activity. And we thought that departments were using a lot of pretty consistent steps in their RFP process. And we realized that departments were using really, really different steps, which isn't necessarily a problem, right? The housing department's procuring really different things than the police department is. But what we learned is that some departments had developed some best practices that really were speeding up the procurement process for them compared to other departments. So by doing this process mapping activity, we kind of created this cohort of folks across the city who were really interested in making the process go faster. And they were able to share those best practices across departments. It also helped us figure out where were we okay with that inconsistency across departments, and where did we actually feel like that inconsistency was causing some problems, so that we could think about helping departments be more consistent on steps where we did feel like it was really important for them to be consistent. And then what that process map turned into was this big giant Excel document of all the different steps and all the different actors and what documents were involved in the process. And having that Excel document was really useful for us because it allowed us to note and keep track of pain points we heard about each process step, and kind of became this living document for us to track process problems. And then what that Excel document turned into was actually like an internal procurement manual that different departments could use, because there were so many people new to the city that had no knowledge of the procurement process. And so having it all written out in a manual was really useful. If we go on to the next slide, there's just a few other examples we wanted to show. And I think we might even have folks from New York City on the call today. But one thing that is so interesting is we think so much about documenting a process correctly, but we don't think about how are we actually educating people on that process. And those people could be internal stakeholders, they could be your city or county or state leadership, they could be the vendor community. And so we wanted to show a few quick examples of folks that we think have done a really good job of kind of helping demystify really complex processes. So this is an example from New York City, and this is on their website, and it's almost like a Candyland type map of the procurement process. And you can click on each of these different sections if you're a vendor to get more information about what would be kind of your responsibility at each step of the process. And we've included the link below if anyone wants to check that out. And then if we go on to the next slide, there's a great organization called Nook Studios, and they're a social enterprise actually out of Australia. And they've worked with many governments to help them create various process maps of really complex government processes that are meant to be shared out with public stakeholders. So this is an example of the process for getting a mining title in New South Wales in Australia. And it's a really hugely complex process. And instead of building a process map with all of those different boxes and triangles and stuff like that, they realized that if they made a process map that looked something like this, it would be a much more useful document for their stakeholders. And then if you go on to the next slide, Isabel, this is another design that they've made that we really like. That's a diagram of the process the Australian Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment has if someone's considering a certain activity. And so time and time again, we hear that new government staff or vendors just feel like the process is a total black box. And so we really like these examples because they're just great kind of calls to action for you to think about. How can you not only map your process internally, but how can you share out that process in a way that's really friendly and welcoming to the vendor community or to other stakeholders that you have? And so with that, let me turn it back over to Isabel.
Great. Thank you so much, Elena and Charlie. That was really helpful with those excellent examples. And hopefully it brings some of what we've been talking to and discussing to life. So in the spirit of incorporating feedback, we are going to pause for a second and let you all respond to this feedback poll so we can gather your insights on how this training went and so we can use it for future training. So just so you know, I just launched the poll. It is completely anonymous, but we would really appreciate if you would take 1 minute to complete it before we continue. Elena, this is where I should be playing music, like you said, to make it more fun. But I see the responses coming in, so you can
That's
imagine the
great.
music.
I was just typing into the chat. If you all also have other ideas for trainings or events that would be useful, or, you know, topics you'd like to talk about with other procurement folks, I'm just gonna put our email in the chat as well. And we'd love to hear those too.
Great. Well, I will let those of you finishing up. Thank you so much for completing that poll. We really appreciate your feedback, and it makes everything that we do a lot more responsive to your needs. So I'm going to end today with a couple of additional resources that we want to point you towards on process efficiency, because we have quite a lot uploaded on the Procurement Excellence Network resource library. Two that I specifically want to call your attention to. The first is this Process Mapping 101 training. That's actually a slide deck that you can download, and it covers a lot of what we reviewed today on the actual mechanics of process mapping and how it can be a tool for your procurement transformation. And I'll note that in the appendix, it has sample slides and notes that you can use to hold your own process mapping sessions with your colleagues. And then the second is this quick read called Using Process Mapping to Save Time and Money, much like this training. And it will go over a lot of what we've talked today. And I think it's definitely worth the read and definitely worth sharing with colleagues who might be interested in learning more about process mapping. And Hope shared a link to how to get all of our process efficiency materials, but especially these two documents in the chat. If you liked what you heard today, we do have monthly events on procurement related topics. So at the end of the month, we are hosting another training on information technology procurements and how to be procuring technology and information technology. And then in April, we have two roundtables to look forward to. One is on green procurement, and the other is on managing grantees and subrecipients who have received federal funding. And then looking forward to May, which I'm in Chicago. Hopefully May is coming soon. We will have a roundtable on surveying your internal customer departments and identifying their pain points. So a lot of really exciting events to look forward to. That is all from us today. We will definitely send a follow-up email with the slide deck and the recording, but just want to take a minute to thank you all so much for your time and for your engagement, especially in these breakout sessions. We hope that you found today's training useful, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. So thanks so much. I know we're ending a little early, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to stay on, but otherwise, have a great rest of your afternoon. And it was great to spend this time with you.
Thank you, everyone.